In mixed martial arts, you have good decisions, you have bad decisions, and you have everything in between. This can sometimes include decisions which may have gone to the correct winner, but they were a lot closer than they were portrayed by either the fans, the media, or the promoter. Sometimes you can have a fighter unanimously getting the verdict in a very close fight, but in order to dispel discussion that this fight was even close and competitive, you will have people try to pretend that the fighter who won did so without any trouble whatsoever. Sometimes these can be more frustrating than robbery decisions because at least the robberies get talked about, whereas often these decisions will get swept under the carpet like they weren't even close. And today I'm going to talk about 5 decisions which in my opinion were very close but did not get treated like they were. Number 5. Jon Jones vs Thiago Santos. When Jon Jones was having his third run as UFC light heavyweight champion, a lot of people expected this fight to be one of his easier title defenses. Little did we know this would actually be Jon Jones' toughest title defense in many years. Thiago Santos, who was written off by many critics going into the fight, ended up giving Jones more trouble than Daniel Cormier, Rampage Jackson, Lyoto Machida, Shogun Rua, and Rashad Evans combined. In the first round, Thiago Santos kicked out Jones' lead leg and had him limping throughout the rest of the fight and afterwards because of it. In the later rounds, Jon Jones had more success kicking out Santos' leg with the oblique kicks, which also had him limping, and picking him apart with jabs. However, Santos continued to land the more damaging blows throughout the fight, knocking Jones' mouthpiece out at one point. Despite barely being able to stand up properly, was able to keep Jones in his shell and had him more gun-shy than almost any opponent ever had before. In the end, Jon Jones was awarded a unanimous decision, but this marked the first time that a fighter had ever won on a judge's scorecard against Jon Jones. Even though the fight was very lackluster, many fans, including myself, were shocked at how close and competitive it was. However, Dana White would have you believe that this fight was incredibly one-sided.
Anybody who scores that fight for Santos is out of their mind.
Really?
Yeah, you should never judge another fight if you judge Santos.
You can tell Dana White is trying to force himself to believe what he is saying, and his reaction to Brett Okamoto saying he thought Thiago Santos won the fight was absolutely hilarious.
I gotta be honest, if you check my Twitter account, I scored at 48-47 for Santos, so I'm done scoring fights, I guess, right?
That makes sense to me.
It's not hard to see why Dana White is saying this, because this would have been terrible for business if Thiago Santos had beaten Jon Jones. To have their number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, who was also one of their biggest pay-per-view draws at the time, lose to an unheralded contender who had not been promoted by the UFC much in a boring fight. Dana White was clearly very happy that Jon Jones got away with this one, so he probably didn't want to even have to imagine going through it again. Number 4. Nate Diaz vs Conor McGregor 2. After Nate Diaz shocked the world by submitting Conor McGregor without any training camp in March, the UFC decided to put together a rematch between the two. Even though Conor McGregor held the UFC featherweight title, and you had Jose Aldo, who had only lost one fight in 10 years, and Frankie Edgar, another MMA legend who had more than earned a shot at the UFC title, waiting in the wings, and the UFC had them fight each other for an interim title, while Conor McGregor got an immediate rematch, despite the UFC not giving it to Jose Aldo. Why?
It's all about the money! It's all about the money!
First couple of rounds, Conor McGregor dropped Nate Diaz 3 times. Nate Diaz claimed, apparently, that he was never hurt by any of these knockdowns, but nonetheless he was losing the rounds regardless. The third round, in typical Nate Diaz fashion, he hurt Conor McGregor and overwhelmed him with a flurry. Conor McGregor won the 4th round and Nate Diaz won the 5th with a takedown no less.
Oh, you're a wrestler now. You're a wrestler, right?
Throughout the last 2 rounds, Nate Diaz constantly taunted Conor McGregor, pointing at him, saying that he was running, and he believed he had won the fight afterwards. Conor McGregor was awarded a majority decision victory. One judge had given the 3rd round 10-8 to Nate Diaz, and even though it was pretty clear that Conor McGregor had won the fight, this is certainly not what was promised by him and his team going into it. Under normal circumstances, a 3rd fight would have been booked between them, certainly in the near future, because Nate Diaz had gotten off the couch and submitted Conor McGregor with ease earlier that year, And Conor McGregor, who had a UFC title and yet was not defending it, certainly didn't deserve to hold on to that title while getting a rematch with Nate Diaz in a non-title bout. The media, who were big fans of Nate Diaz, didn't push for an immediate rematch, probably because they expected the division to move on and for Conor McGregor to defend his title against Jose Aldo. Yet, none of that happened, and instead Conor McGregor got another lightweight title shot against Eddie Alvarez. How could the UFC hold up the featherweight division like this? Well,
it's all about the money. It's all about the money.
There certainly was no robbery, and it's understandable why Conor McGregor did get the victory. But if a fighter is able to stop you without a training camp, constantly taunt you throughout the rematch, and claim that you are running from them, then certainly you would want to leave no doubt in another fight. But now, almost 8 years later, that has yet to happen. And Dana White was certainly not so big on there being a third fight between them. In fact, he openly spoke against it for many years. Number 3. Israel Adesanya vs Robert Whitaker 2. 2.5 years after their first encounter, the two greatest middleweights behind Anderson Silva would rematch. Robert Whitaker was dropped in the first round, but adopted a very cautious approach throughout the rest of the fight, fighting on the back foot, looking for takedowns, and relying heavily on his very accurate jab. Israel Adesanya was the aggressor, but wasn't the effective aggressor. Adesanya was able to land clean leg kicks throughout the fight, but Robert Whitaker was able to equalize that with his jab, which at times was snapping Israel Adesanya's head back. He was able to get takedowns in the 4 remaining rounds, even took Adesanya's back in the 4th, and in the eyes of the majority of fans it seems, was able to win 3 of the 5 rounds. Most of the media scored the fight for Israel Adesanya. Dana White, who certainly was happy that Israel Adesanya was able to remain champion over Robert Whitaker, who certainly was not the personality type that they preferred, didn't even lend credence to the idea that Robert Whitaker arguably won the fight. Aside from the fans scoring the fight online for Robert Whitaker, there were media members who thought he had won the fight. But other high-profile media members acted like this fight wasn't remotely competitive, and Eugene Berman, who would prove to be one of MMA's most successful coaches, but also perhaps the most hypocritical, acted like Adesanya dominated the fight easily. I thought Robert Whitaker won the fight, but I'm not going to call this a robbery. However, Mike Beltran did score rounds 4 and 5 for Israel Adesanya. They were Whitaker's clearest rounds, which prove that Beltran is better suited for refereeing fights than judging them. Number 2, Israel Adesanya vs Yoel Romero. When Adesanya knocked out Robert Whitaker in Perth, many people believed this would be the next UFC superstar. The way he beat a legend like that was very, very impressive. His first title defense was against Yoel Romero, who was coming off 2 straight defeats, but many people believed that he had a case for winning at least one of them. Therefore, this fight was highly anticipated. They had a very intense stare down which lasted a long time, including into the fight, unfortunately. Dana White had torn Tyrone Woodley and Damian Maia to shreds for breaking the record for throwing the fewest punches in a 5-round title fight. Well, this one was even more lackluster. Not only was the fight incredibly boring, but when you rewatch it, there is a legit case for Yoel Romero winning. He landed the only clear punch in the entire first round. In the second round, he swarmed Adesanya, landing a few clean punches, which was more than anything Adesanya had done. In rounds 3 and 4, Adesanya clearly won due to leg kicks. But in the 5th round, Romero, at 42, was more active than Adesanya, landing the cleaner shots, outstriking him, and he chased him around the cage at times. He also gave us the only entertaining part of the entire fight by yelling at Adesanya and giving a very interesting post-fight interview. After the fight, Dana White put all the blame on Yoel Romero for the fight being boring, despite the fact that he chased him around in the 5th round and Adesanya was very inactive himself. While most of the media scored the fight for Israel Adesanya, the fans ended up scoring the fight for Yoel Romero due to rounds 1, 2, and 5.
But I scored that 3 rounds to 2 for Romero. There were many journalists that scored it for Romero that I saw.
Donks.
You can imagine who was triggered with this idea even being brought up. Even more so than Jon Jones against Thiago Santos, a Romero victory would have been disastrous for the UFC. Israel Adesanya, like I said, was expected to achieve superstardom. For him to lose in his first title defense in one of the worst fights of all time would have been absolutely disastrous for business. Hence why Dana White was very happy to move on from the fight and ignore the idea that Romero arguably should have won. Number 1. Quinton Jackson versus Forrest Griffin. With back-to-back victories over Chuck Liddell and Dan Henderson, many people expected Rampage Jackson to go on to be a dominant champion. Forrest Griffin, who just 2 fights ago had fought Hector Ramirez, was unexpectedly challenging for the title after a huge upset victory over Mauricio Shogun Rua. In the fight, Rampage Jackson knocked Forrest Griffin down in the first round, but had his leg badly hurt in the second. Forrest Griffin dominated the rest of that round, and the rest of the fight was very tightly contested. In the end, all 3 judges gave the fight to Forrest Griffin. Rampage Jackson always claimed that he won this fight, and that he got an unfair shake from the judges. Personally, I thought the fight should have been a draw, but 2 judges gave the first round to Forrest Griffin, which in itself was a robbery, because Rampage Jackson knocked Forrest Griffin down in that round. How the judges gave that round to Forrest Griffin is absurd. If Adelaide Bird had scored the first round correctly, the fight would have been a majority decision in favour of Griffin, which would have further increased the debate as to whether or not a rematch should have happened. And it is a bit strange that the UFC never talked about making a rematch between these two. Forrest Griffin actually talked about it in the cage after the fight, saying that he felt a rematch should happen. Rampage Jackson always called for it, and this fight got Fight of the Year in 2008. So you do wonder why there weren't talks of a rematch. Rampage was one of the biggest stars in the UFC at the time, and Forrest Griffin had made himself a big star with this victory. Rampage Jackson always claimed that the UFC held a grudge against him for taking out their biggest star at the time in Chuck Liddell. He also claimed that his relationship did not get better after he lost the championship because he took the A-Team movie, and the UFC always held that against him. At the time, the UFC was not so big on immediate rematches. They were very interested in keeping the division moving, and the light heavyweight division was one of the most stacked at the time. But given that the UFC did occasionally butt heads with Rampage Jackson, it's not surprising that it took many years for him to get back at the UFC title. And again, this would have made them a lot of money, so you do wonder why the UFC didn't make the rematch years later and instead ended up giving Shogun Rua the rematch with Forrest Griffin. So I hope you guys liked this list that I made. Let me know which fights you would have added to the list, and maybe I will make a part 2 in the future, so let me know if you feel that there should be decisions that I should talk about. Also, how did you score the fights that I have included on this list? Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more, as always.